Have you ever thought that there are people who will never be overtaken by the terrible darkness of the grave or the infernal furnace of the crematorium? They can't die in principle, even if they want to. Of course, the truth was interpreted to everyone. Everything that has a beginning must necessarily have an end. Of course, in the vast majority of cases this is exactly the case, but who said, and most importantly proved, that there are no exceptions? Life, as we usually understand it, originated on planet Earth about 4 billion years ago, and it is a rather complex phenomenon. So far, attempts to create a real living organism from a set of molecules have faced great difficulties, and the very definition of life is interpreted differently by various modern researchers. Nevertheless, over the course of 4 billion years, life on Earth has evolved, most likely according to Darwinian laws of natural selection, and has come to such a supreme manifestation as man. We all know that man is mortal and on average lives in the modern civilized world for about 80 years. The eternal existence of man, a kind of continuation of his earthly life, is the basis of all religions. But is it possible to realize eternal life for the human body in our real world, and not in a divine or mystical sense? What should pass into eternity, the whole person or some special part of him? Let's start by talking about what exactly we would like to move into eternity, the whole person or some specific part of him. Most religions claim that it is not the whole person who passes into eternity as a whole organism, but some special part of him, the soul. If we approach this from a scientific point of view, then in fact we can recognize that some parts of the human body are more important than other parts of it in terms of preserving a person as an independent person. After all, losing, for example, an arm, a leg, an eye, a kidney, and even when transplanting someone else's heart, a person's personality does not disappear. Apparently, such an organ as the brain is responsible for the personality ego of a particular person. We will not now delve into the discussion of the problem of how living organisms that do not have a brain, or have only its rudiments, perceive themselves. We believe that a certain sense of personality is inherent in any living being that has some kind of shell. Thus, for the eternal existence of a person as a specific person, we must preserve the brain as long as possible, and the rest of the organs are already attached to it for the fullness of life sensations. But we will go further and now speculate about whether it is necessary to preserve a person's personality to preserve his entire brain, or whether it is possible to save only some special part of the brain, copy it to a new medium, natural or artificial. Some of the researchers believe that the whole brain is responsible for the human ego, and in cases of non-fatal brain damage, the remaining intact part of the brain takes over the function of personality. Other researchers believe that the human ego is localized in some specific part of the brain, most likely in its cortex. But what is the human ego? Here's what Wikipedia says about it. Ego, according to psychoanalytic theory, that part of the human personality that is realized as I and is in contact with the outside world through perception. The ego carries out planning, evaluation, memorization, and reacts in other ways to the effects of the physical, spiritual, and social environment. It is a data set designed primarily by general awareness of one's body, one's existence, and then by memory data. A person has a certain idea about his past existence, certain sets of memories. These two components are the main constituents of the ego. We would like to supplement this definition of I somewhat, and it could be as follows. The ego of a living being is more or less constant, created by an active nervous system, mainly the brain, the feeling of a living organism of its integrity and some kind of reference point of the center of the world. The center of decision-making and free will, combined with a certain personal history recorded in its nervous system, life experience, knowledge, certain ideas about the outside world and the ways to interact with it, based on their capabilities, preferences, and skills. Therefore, we will assume that our task of preserving or transferring the ego of a particular person will be completed if this new self feels about the same. He will present himself as a kind of center of the world, possessing some kind of free will. He will remember his former history to some extent. He will perceive people and places as known and woven into his consciousness. And he will also have a part of his former reflexes, skills, moral and ideological attitudes. The ego is a brain structure that arose by chance and fixed in the process of evolution, as a kind of new self-perception of organisms in the world, a kind of new distinction between a living being and an external world in relation to it. And if it is somehow fixed by natural selection, then it gives some advantages to the organism possessing this ego. Self-awareness is especially useful for social animals, which include us humans. This gives us an idea of ourselves, our strengths and weaknesses, and also allows us to understand the behavior of others in many ways. Note that in many primitive cultures, there was no concept of an individual I separate from the tribe, and in some indigenous languages there was not even a word for I. That is, there is no divine or similar principle in a person's possession of his I. The ego of living organisms arose at some stage of evolution, and in one way or another helps the body to exist, to survive in a complex, changing world, including communicating more successfully with other living organisms. Personality formation is genetically inherent in us and, for example, it manifests itself as a reproductive function at a certain age and actually consists of a certain number of neurons in our brain and their connections. Moreover, all neurons are given to us initially at birth, but in order to form a personality, a certain number of their connections are needed, which arise during the experience of the first few years of our existence. Apparently, a person's identity is formed by about the third year of his life. By this time, the child's brain reaches almost 80% of the adult brain volume. The cerebral cortex and limbic system are already sufficiently developed, which allows children to recognize and express various emotions, play, talk, and count. According to Jacques Lacan's theory, a child between the ages of 6 and 18 months begins to realize that the person looking at him in the mirror is his own reflection. And this, according to Lacan, indicates the formation of the structure of his subjectivity, his personality. The adult brain contains an average of 90 billion neurons and 85 billion non-neural cells. At the same time, the cerebral cortex contains up to 20% of all neurons. If we believe that the ego of living beings appeared only in the late stages of evolution and lives mainly in the brain, then most likely it is somehow connected with the most evolutionarily late parts of the brain. Experiments on stimulating and blocking various parts of the brain make it possible to make a fairly detailed map of the brain and identify those parts of it that are more responsible than others for a person's sense of self as a person. That is, for example, we can distinguish neurons in the brain that are specialized for receiving external information or regulating the work of internal organs, but there are groups of neurons that, as it were, connect the entire body together and form a sense of self. It is these sections that we should copy first. Scientists claim that from the point of view of cybernetics, the brain is a giant learning statistical analog machine made of living ionic elements without a rigid structure of connections between the elements. One of the most important properties of the brain is its ability to build models, both when trying to describe processes occurring in nature and to describe fictional abstract phenomena, both consciously and unconsciously. The human brain builds and corrects models of the world around it and makes predictions based on these models. Scientists tried to compare the human brain with a computer hard drive and calculated that human memory is capable of containing about 1 million gigabytes or 1 petabyte. Considering that the human brain uses only 25 watts of energy to process such a large array of information, it can be called the most efficient computing device on Earth. It's pretty hard to believe, but most likely the human body as a whole is a convention, an illusion. Our brain, receiving information from both our internal organs and from the outside, creates a certain image, a model of our body, which has a certain subjectivity, a certain I. Thomas Metzinger, in his book The Ego Tunnel, analyzes this process in detail. Again, we will not dive into this topic now. We will only note that our brain can adapt our body to new conditions. This gives us hope that our I will, under certain circumstances, accept our new body, make it a part of our I. Besides, there are already immortal living beings on Earth. There are creatures on Earth that can live forever and not grow old. Some trees, corals, mollusks, hydra, jellyfish, all these creatures can theoretically live forever, while not aging at all. However, accidental death is quite possible for them. Permanent regeneration applies to both damaged tissue and the aging process itself. That is, the basis of their immortality is in constant rejuvenation, self-reproduction of their tissues, recreating themselves on a new basis. Therefore, humans can become immortal in the same way. It is only necessary to find out which part of the human body is most responsible for its self-identification and try to learn how to transfer this particular part to a new basis, regenerate it. In fact, wildlife constantly uses copying. Our children are essentially our copies. Their copying takes place with the help of about 20,000 parental genes, each of which consists of a certain sequence of several hundred pairs of foot types of nucleotides. It is estimated that the human genome contains approximately 800 megabytes of information, which is comparable to the amount of information on a single CD. Over time, we will learn how to encode and preserve the ego of a particular person, just like nature did, encoding and copying the structure of our body. The facts confirming the presence of several eyes in one brain suggest that the human ego can be transferred or copied from a given, specific brain to other media, both biological and non-biological. For a particular person to exist practically in eternity, we need to learn how to save or copy about 10 billion neurons of the cortex of his brain and their connections responsible for his self-identification. Modern science against aging and immortality is still powerless. Biogerontologists, these are those who study the biological processes of aging, say that not everything is lost. By the year 2036, they believe, we will be able to overcome old age. Perhaps one day we can easily replace internal organs, take supplements that slow down the aging of our cells, and live forever. After all, who knows what awaits us in 100 years?